so much for that introduction, Isabel. I'll go ahead and share the presentation for Deniz to start.
All right, wonderful. And thank you so much, Isabel, for the great introduction. And thank you all for having us. And thanks for joining us today on this fun topic. We're so happy to meet you all. And we, as your East Coast Fellows, are so excited to meet you all. So today we're going to be talking about pivoting from in-person to remote teaching. I guess if there's one thing that the pandemic teaching helped us understand, is that pivoting from one modality like in-person to remote is not simply copying and pasting the pedagogy or moving all the material to an online venue. In-person teaching and remote teaching have their own unique challenges and benefits. But we learned over the 2 years, perhaps, that the pivoting is, when it's done deliberately, we can tap into the best of these two worlds, which we will be talking about today. We can move on. So first of all, thank you for the survey participation. We carefully read your responses and noticed that the majority of audience are either educators who teach fully in person or those who teach fully remote. This talk will apply to all groups, and also including those two categories and the hybrid groups. Today, we hope that you will gain some information about some active learning techniques that would increase student engagement and learning. Second, we will provide you some tools that would pivot your in-person or synchronous teaching into remote and or asynchronous learning so that you could consider optimizing your teaching approach. And finally, at the very end, you'll be able to apply some of the techniques or tools that we will discuss here on improving your course syllabus per your choice, either your own syllabus or the sample syllabi that we provide with you with the activity. So we plan to spend about 20 minutes for the tools and the methods. And then, as I mentioned, we will do a 20-minute activity, including the discussion. And then we'll open the floor to all of you so that we can discuss your questions, or if you have any comments, we're happy to interact with you all. Okay. All right, so let's start with this categorization. Perhaps up until the pandemic, unless you're part of some kind of a MOOC or an online program at a university or in your university, this dichotomy, in-person versus remote, wasn't quite relevant to you, because by default, we would go to a physical classroom and teach in person. But all of a sudden, almost overnight, when the pandemic hit, we found ourselves trying to pivot to a new modality of teaching, remote teaching. Then we increasingly began to hear some other terms like hybrid or HyFlex as we moved on in this pandemic teaching or emergency teaching. And it's perhaps straightforward what an in-person or remote teaching mean. It should be all clear, I guess, by now. But if you think these terms as the two extremes in a spectrum, you would think hybrid and HyFlex are in the middle of that spectrum, and they're like cousins of each other. Hybrid teaching combines in-person and remote learning activities, whereas HyFlex teaching is a form of hybrid, but in this form, students are given the flexibility to participate either in person or online or remote. In the next slide, we talk about another dichotomy that is, again, very relevant to us, especially these days than ever before, is this distinction between synchronous and asynchronous learning. So you teach something, and then your teaching and your students' learning happen at the same time. So this is synchronous. Again, up until the pandemic, perhaps this was almost the default assumption, unless you would be involved in some MOOCs. But we began to hear this asynchronous learning more often than ever before, because now it's more integrated into the traditional teaching. Okay, so as in-person and synchronous teaching was the default for many years, for many educators, maybe probably for you, the assumption was that these have been default because they are the best way of teaching. However, you have probably noticed that remote teaching and asynchronous learning are not necessarily the poorer alternatives to an in-person and synchronous learning. The issue is that there is not the right approach, but there are better circumstances under which certain modality works better than the other one. And we believe that the next phase of education will not go back to the fully in-person and synchronous teaching. There will be maybe inevitable circumstances where educators will want to try combining modalities for a variety of reasons. And then the question is, what are the circumstances, certain activities in which remote and or asynchronous teaching may be a better alternative? And some activities may very well work better, maybe, when students work or participate remotely. You may consider moving some of your teaching to asynchronous so that you would save up some time, that you would use your classroom time with your students more effectively. And there's a substantial body of research that shows that when used deliberately, instructor-student interaction during the classroom time could be extremely effective for students' learning. And also asynchronous learning, the time spent outside of the classroom can be enhanced by helping students more engage with the activity. And then the question boils down to what kind of activities that could work in remote and asynchronous that would keep student engagement and even increase student engagement and enhance their learning. So quick answer for that question, I guess, is active learning. So what are those activities, right? In these activities, students mostly work in groups, at least have some substantial interaction with their peers, engage with learning activities, and then have the opportunity to reflect on these activities or use some higher cognitive skills, higher order thinking skills, such as critical thinking or problem solving. So we put some references here in the slide. If you'd like to learn more about the impact and the implications of active learning on students' engagement and learning, you can check it out. And we have also references at the very end. Okay, so at this point, I think it's useful to talk about active learning in comparison with its kind of opposite, passive learning. So some examples of passive learning is that you go to a class and you listen to a lecture or a presentation or recitation or exhibition, or you study for a recall recognition-based quiz where you basically go through a textbook and read and try to remember the facts. These should be very much familiar to you because most of traditional education methods primarily rely on these passive learning, at least in the past, but there's a trend for active learning activities, and which we would like to emphasize today. So how about active learning activities? And we were so glad to see that in your syllabi and at FIDM, the most of syllabi have substantial number of active learning activities. So some of the items in this list were actually taken from those syllabi because we wanted to make this presentation as relevant to you as possible. So some examples of active learning is where you are assigned a reading and then come to a class to discuss those readings. Case studies, for example, are good examples. Debates are very good for critical thinking, design demonstrations or making design during the class, interactive lectures where instructors ask questions via polls and do group discussions. There are two other active learning activities that I'm particularly fan of, because I'm working with Professor Eric Mazur at Harvard. He's the pioneer of these two methods, peer instruction and flipped classroom. I'm actually co-authoring a paper with Professor Mazur. For those who are interested in learning more, please shoot me an email. I'm happy to share a copy when it's ready. Okay, so in the next slide.
Deniz, I just wanted to add a couple of things, if that's okay. So first thing I wanted to add is that the idea of active versus passive learning, that in reality, it can be viewed as a spectrum. So if we take the traditional lecture, for example, which is what's called sometimes the sage on the stage, that is indeed a form of passive learning. But if the lecturer uses tools, which we will talk about, to allow more interaction, to check in on whether the students are understanding the material, for like formative assessment with using polling, for example, or quick quizzes, allowing some Q&A, then the lecture becomes somewhat more active. So there are methods which are more active than others, but at the same time, we can take a passive method and make it somewhat more active. Another thing I wanted to point out is the idea of ownership. One of the reasons that we do want students to work asynchronously without us being present is because we would like them to take ownership over their own learning. And asynchronous learning, when done right, of course, can really, really help with that. And of course, that tremendously helps with engagement, because we ultimately want them to be motivated and being engaged with the material that they are learning. So yeah, that's it for me. Does anyone have any questions so far about anything that we spoke about? Okay, so Isabel, just let us know if there are any questions in the chat.
Okay, well, thanks, Rea, for that information. And I truly believe in the benefit of giving students autonomy, and I guess creating very well-designed asynchronous activities are a great way of giving students autonomy, thus ownership of their learning. And as the research shows, it increases their self-efficacy, and then a lot of different positive outcomes, including engagement, even their well-being. So if those who are interested, I'm happy to share some of the resources. So let's look at some examples. We wanted to talk about a couple of samples of passive learning. We wanted to start with the passive learning activities, and then how we can transform these into an asynchronous and or remote teaching. But for this one particularly, so it's kind of a two-step process. So in the next slide, we will show the step or the process in which you can turn your passive learning activity, if you have any, or if you consider transforming any, into an asynchronous or remote learning. But the first step is to make it to an active learning to the extent possible. So because pivoting an in-person passive learning activity in a remote, when it's done effectively, it can lead to a very effective asynchronous and remote learning. Otherwise, it wouldn't look different than teaching online the same way that you would teach in a physical classroom. But we want to tweak so that the passive learning activities are transformed into asynchronous and remote platforms or modalities effectively. Okay. Keeping that in our minds, let's start with this very traditional way of learning, which is a traditional lecture. So as the instruction-based teaching, you would probably recognize that a teacher and instructor is on the stage in an amphitheater in a classroom, which is a form of passive learning, could be transformed into flipped classroom. For those who are not familiar with this term, which was developed by Professor Eric Mazur, as you see in the picture on the right, the instructor uses the classroom time to coach students, to guide them, to moderate discussions instead of lecturing. Well, where does the lecturing take place? Outside of the classroom. Students come prepared to the class either by watching pre-recorded videos or doing some reading assignments. And then when they come to the class, they are ready to discuss ideas, ask questions to the instructor, or discuss problems with their peers and receive meaningful feedback from their peers and their instructors. And this works very well in an in-person format. So you may implement it as an in-person activity, but in the next couple of slides, we will discuss how you could turn into this kind of flipped classroom into an asynchronous or remote format too. Another passive learning activity that we wanted to discuss that you could consider transforming is that we probably all experience at some point is like reading texts, which is often rote and mostly not effective because retention rate is very low. But thankfully, reading doesn't have to be done individually. in isolation and passively. There's a tool called Perizol. For those who are not familiar, this is a very useful platform for inviting your students to a collaborative reading. So you basically upload PDFs or your readings, and then students collaboratively highlight sentences and comment on those sentences and ask questions to each other. And as you can see, passive learning can be turned into an active learning activity by creating a venue for students to discuss readings, challenge their assumptions, and answer each other's questions. And with a Harvard computer science professor, Mike Smith, I actually wrote a paper which is under review, and for those who are interested, I'm happy to share that paper where we discuss how using such a platform actually increase student engagement. Okay, so in this one, so we looked at how we could transform a passive learning activity into either an effective active learning in person, or moving a little more further, turning that into a asynchronous or remote learning activity. So how about you have active learning activities in your syllabus, in your teaching? How about turning them into a remote or asynchronous activities to increase student engagement? Okay, so we have 4 examples that I'll be going through very quickly. So this one, the first one is case studies. Case studies are very much established active learning methods. In a physical classroom, this is how it would look like normally. If you're teaching case studies, please feel free to put your experiences in the chat. But students come together in a physical classroom. They discuss the stakeholders, the decisions, what's at stake, for example, that is explained in a case, so on and so forth. And then they decompose the case into manageable pieces. Students are either discussing around tables where they are given sticky notes, white papers, or they use whiteboards in small groups. However, one thing that many case teachers, at least the ones that I interacted with, especially when they were first transitioning to remote teaching abruptly, was that they said the discussions and the case analysis weren't going to be effective without these artifacts, tools, whiteboards, these kind of tools that facilitate brainstorming or visualizations, visualization tools. But over the last couple of years, many tools became available, and I wanted to introduce you this tool that I personally like very much. It's called Miro. We use it quite often. It's very handy, very interactive. Students can use in different rooms or whiteboards, they can use sticky notes, they can create multiple boards, and then after that, they can save the PDFs. And case teaching can be very well pivoted into remote teaching by tools like Miro. I'm sure there are many more examples that you can think of, just as an example. Okay, how about interactive lectures? So in a class, if you want to make it more interactive, I assume you would ask your students to raise hands, do kind of a poll, for example, especially if it's kind of a debate. And this, if done in a remote environment, such as using a tool like Poll Everywhere that we wanted to provide you as an example, can be actually even more effective because you would have more engagement, especially from those who are either shy or want to remain anonymous. You can also mimic interactive discussion in a platform like Ed, as you see in the right-hand side, where you can create chat rooms and monitor interaction among students. And that's a nice way of pivoting your synchronous interactive lecture or discussion into a synchronous one. Okay, and then finally, as we briefly discussed before, peer instruction is a great way of engaging students because they are supposed to teach each other, as the name suggests. This has been implemented as an in-person synchronous pedagogy, where students come to the same place at the same time and teach each other and discuss the concepts. However, with tools like Desmos, I'm sure there are so many others, but this is at least the ones that we use. You can create a venue for students where they can do collaborative problem solving on notebooks, where they can discuss ideas, problems, they can solve, draw diagrams, like as you see, they can even be a little more creative. Also, learning catalytics, as you see on the right bottom, is another platform where you could use or turn your synchronous peer instruction activity into an asynchronous one. You can use it also synchronously, which Professor Eric Mazur was using for many years, but now students could also be assigned work through learning catalytics and solve problems first individually and then in team rounds, where they're supposed to teach and discuss questions to each other, which could be very well done outside of the class as an asynchronous form. Okay, so finally, in the next slide, yes. Yeah, we talked about flipped classroom, which could be very well done in person. It's very effective. It's a very effective learning activity. You can record your lectures in a platform called Panopto, which again, we use quite often, where you could have timestamps on your video, embed some online quizzes, and allow students to ask you questions. This is a great way of engaging students asynchronously and remotely. And that in some way could be even more effective for your students to learn the concepts, because when they come to the class to meet you, you can use that time more effectively and give feedback and moderate the discussions during the class time.
All right, so over to me. So everything Deniz presented, of course, these are very good approaches, are very good ideas for, firstly, how to take some passive or more passive learning activities and make them more active. And secondly, how to take active learning activities that are done synchronously and in person, and perhaps move them to remote or asynchronous modalities if we find that that will be useful for us and for the students. However, as we all know, in the real world, there are all kinds of obstacles to implementing these ideas in practice and over time. And we could divide these into 5 categories. There's the issue of technology. Do I, as an instructor, know how to use the technology? Do I have the time to learn how to use the technology? And the same questions can be asked about the students as well. Secondly is the workload, especially the upfront amount of hours of work that we might have to do in order to, for example, record all our lectures. The third obstacle sometimes is the issue of training and support. Do we have the right equipment? Can we receive the training required? Fourth is the instructional quality. We might be concerned that if we have a lack of experience in a certain method of teaching or using a certain technological tool, that the quality of instruction may suffer. And finally, student interaction, which is another concern when we use remote or asynchronous methods. So this specific talk, of course, we don't have the time to go through every single obstacle, but the general idea, and I will show in the next slide the process, but the general concept of this is that you don't have to redesign your entire course, and certainly it's not a good idea to start with that notion. The idea, and this is the activity also that we will ask you to carry out today, is to go through your syllabus or the sample syllabi that we provide you with and find one component that you are confident with, that you think, you know what, this one can be made more active. This one, if I manage to move it remotely or asynchronously or both, I would be able to save some time to do other things that I want to do in person with the students. So the general approach is to really reduce the scope of what you are going to pilot, of what you're going to try for the first time. And another good idea, of course, is to collaborate with other instructors on the same kind of pivot or conversion of that component of your course. Now, in terms of the actual process that we would suggest, first, as I said already, identify points of cost-effective improvement in your course. What is it specifically that if you converted this specific component into either more active learning, or if it's already active, into remote and or asynchronous, you would gain the most bang for your buck, so to speak. Then formulate an initial plan and gather resources. So think about, how am I actually going to carry out this conversion? how much time do I have to put into learning the new technology or talking to my fellow instructors or my students, and actually carry out a plan for what the milestones are for you to get to the point where you can successfully implement this. Don't sort of just start, but sit and think about, how am I going to plan this out? Then involve the stakeholders in this redesign and get their buy-in. The stakeholders are your fellow instructors and faculty, your students, maybe there's some people in administration, in IT support even, that you need to speak to. Explain to them what your objective is. Explain to them why you want to change this component in your course. And you will find that people will be probably more open to help, and your students will be more ready for it once they understand what the potential benefits are of doing this. Then modify your course syllabus accordingly, and then adapt your instructional materials. So if you have some lectures which are, say, PowerPoint presentations, record yourself over them. Use Panopto, allow your students to annotate. So this is the general process that we would suggest. And again, focus on just one thing that you think would be the most time effective and most cost effective for you and for your students, for your specific course. So I want to very quickly go through an example, which is my course, which I taught for the first time in the fall of 2020. And this was the first time in my life that I taught a remote course. Previously, I was the instructional designer of some MOOCs, but I did not teach them myself. I was the instructional designer. I wrote the screenplays, the learning objectives, the learning progression, but I was not teaching them. So I had the challenge of coming up with a remote course for first-year students who have yet to declare their major. So they were in all kinds of STEM fields at MIT. And the core of this course was about teaching them what we call the neat ways of thinking. And specifically, we chose 4, which are creative thinking, systems thinking, recursive or analytical thinking, and making. And the idea was that every 2 weeks, I was joined by a different instructor from our program in a different domain. And we would focus on a specific challenge for those 2 weeks and tackle that challenge using that way of thinking. So this specific course really did involve many active learning activities. And it was mostly asynchronous and remote, because there was 1 hour in class every week, which was on Zoom, and then 2 hours out of class, which were mostly team-based. So just to go through this very quickly, as you can see, there's a really wide variety of challenges. I won't sort of read them out, but you can see that they're very different from each other, different instructor, different way of thinking. And in weeks 10 and 11, the students actually chose their own challenges, and each team tackled it with a different way of thinking. And actually, for the final 2 weeks, we sent them kits for casting and molding of a simple figurine. So they actually got to do hands-on activity. So in terms of the actual assignments that students did, we had preparation assignments, and I'm still teaching this course, by the way. I actually prefer teaching it remotely. I moved it to in-person this last semester, and I found out that overall, this specific course is better done remotely because of all the moving parts, all the different instructors involved, and we also bring on guest students from our program and so on. So there is a preparation assignment, which is a short video. It's a mini lecture about a neat way of thinking. And the students then fill out a very quick, simple quiz about basic concepts. So they do this before the class. The bulk of the course is these application assignments, which are mostly done in a team. So we're teaching them a method, a tool, or a technique in creative thinking. Now we want them to apply it to the challenge and then present it in class afterwards. And we also give them individual or team feedback on their assignments. We have example assignments when we ask them to give us an example of someone who is exhibiting systems thinking, give us an example of someone who's exhibiting creative thinking. And then we look and see whether they've understood the various concepts that we taught them and that they practiced. And finally, we have reflection assignments. And these are beginning, middle, and end of the course. So we want to see how they view themselves as creative thinkers, as systems thinkers, as makers, as analytical thinkers, how they view themselves in the beginning, middle, and end of the course. So these are all very much geared towards active learning and engagement. And as I've said already, from what I'm seeing, it's actually, in this case, the student engagement, it was actually better when it was done remotely. And before we get to the individual activity, maybe we'll pause for a minute just for if anybody has any questions about what we've gone through so far, so that we're ready for the activity. Isabel, just let us know if there's anything in the chat, and if not, we can continue to the activity.
There is nothing in the chat, so I think we can move on.
Excellent. So we have an actual link to the individual activity, and we'll give you 10 minutes for that. So the idea is that use your own course syllabus or one of the other syllabi that Isabel will provide a link to, and these are, of course, anonymized. Describe what would you like to improve? What's your objective? Would you like to enhance student engagement? Would you like to save time for meaningful in-person instruction in class? Or do you have another objective, something else you'd like to improve about your teaching in the course or students learning? Then select one component that you would like to convert to achieve this objective, suggest how you would convert it, and then mention what tool or combination of tools you would use. So just to walk you through the actual activity so that you can see what it's about. So I'm dropping a link in the chat right now, but I'm also going to share it. So if you could please go to this link, it will give you editing rights. Please don't edit, don't do anything yet. I will quickly explain what the activity is about. So the first 3 slides, please don't edit them. The first 3 slides just provide you with the information that you need. So the first slide is what I just went through, which are the instructions. And the second ones are, the first one is how you can convert passive learning activities to active learning activities. And the second one is how you can take active learning activities and turn them to remote and or asynchronous. So we provided you here with direct links to all these different tools, and also with the idea of what the different activities are and how you can convert them. So what I would like each one of you to do is just pick a slide from slide 4 onwards. It doesn't matter what slide, they're all the same, as you can see. I'm actually going through slides now, but they're all the same. Choose one, put in your name and course title, and just answer those 4 questions. And using the first 3 slides for your information, so that you can get some information. So please get started with that. You can just click on the link and do that. And Isabel, in case somebody didn't bring their syllabus or doesn't want to use their syllabus, could you put the link to a folder with some anonymized syllabi? So just feel free. Isabel picked out some very diverse syllabi. So whatever fits, whatever catches your fancy more is the one you can go for. So please fill out that slide. And then in 10 minutes time, we'll just have a quick sharing of ideas. We really want everyone else here and after to benefit from the different ideas that you may come up with. So let's take 10 minutes and do that.
Rea, and Isabel, I wanted to make sure this, or if anyone is having a problem with accessing or need a grant access.
It should have editing access for everybody.
Okay, because with my, all right.
Is the link not working for you, Deniz?
I tried with another, yes. So
okay.
Yeah, but as Patricia said, I tried
let me check that again. My apologies.
So the slides are all the same, and we're meant to each of us take one slide and put our own input.
Exactly. Exactly. Can people try this new link? And if you need specific access, please request it and I'll give it to you right away. But it should provide you with direct edits. If not, then what I can do, I can actually download the presentation and you can just fill out a slide as a PowerPoint. So I'll do that right now, just in case.
It looks like it's working right now, at least at my end.
Okay. Is it not working for anyone? Because I just created a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, you have access. Okay, great. Thank you, Patricia, for letting us know.
Yeah, for me, it's working as well.
Okay, great.
Feel free to take one of your syllables. I provided already some links. You can actually even change the name if you want to. So it's like not.
And Deniz and I are here, obviously, to help if anything isn't clear. If you want to, consult us on anything. I know it's a lot of information coming at you at super speed, but we wanted to give you a chance to actually practice this a little bit and reflect on it a little bit, rather than us just talking. So let's take 8 more minutes. Okay, I'm going to check. Maybe we'll just take 2 more minutes or so, 3 more minutes. I can see already a lot of activity. Very nice. Okay, everyone, maybe we'll just take 1 more minute. I know that, of course, we could all spend a lot more time. I'm sure you all spend a lot more time thinking about your course design, but it's just to whet our appetite and get us started. Of course, I'm also mindful of the time. I want to leave some time for presentations and questions. So if we'll all just take 1 more minute, please. Okay, so very happy to see how engaged everyone is. Is there anybody who's maybe volunteering to share their thoughts and what they thought? I'm just going to share screen for the presentation and see if anyone is willing to. The next, few minutes, we won't have time to go through everything, but if there is one of you who is maybe willing to discuss their ideas with us. So we have Brian, Isabel. Isabel, I may pick on you if nobody else volunteers.
Absolutely, no worries.
Okay, so let's go with Isabel, I guess.
Okay, perfect. So let me go and yes. Okay, so then one of my challenges, currently I am actually teaching e-learning, which is synchronous. And then the way that I'm doing is that, of course, I have the case analysis because we're at the business department. So then currently the way that I'm doing it is like I have individual case analysis because I don't have the component for them to interact. I have like students in China and I have students in South America. So it's like really different, the time zone. But I think that right now with one of the ideas that you guys talk about using like a tool such as Miro, it could be like a good way of bringing together like back that component of interacting and creating something more in collaboration. So I think that that's something that I would like to explore. Some of the elements that I really want to avoid so far and is being kind of like always the main challenge is about critical thinking, collaboration, and of course, plagiarism. So then a way of currently working with these issues is that I'm kind of adding questions that are more relevant about current the current context and situation. So then I have like the case analysis that they have in the book, the textbook, but then always the last two questions, I always tweak them in a way that I make them look for questions and answers that are more appropriate to what is happening right now. So then they kind of just go online and then copy and paste, but they actually need to take the answer into the next level. That's actually the way that I'm kind of avoiding the plagiarism and then improving the critical thinking component. So I don't know if Miro, because as I mentioned, I haven't used it yet. So I don't know if Miro has the way of, for example, if I have students in different time zones, maybe start creating something and then someone else can come here and then finish something kind of similar to the Google Drive, which is kind of like in real time, you can make changes and then share the information. But I'm really actually excited to try it. So I don't know if you, Rea or Deniz, have like any suggestions about, you know, this type of component of case analysis.
I think this is more in terms of textual analysis, critical thinking, so on, more up Deniz's street. Deniz, maybe you have some comments or suggestions to make here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Mirror would be a very good tool for that, especially if you're asking your students to engage with the case, either in groups or in larger groups. For the asynchronous, turning that into asynchronous, I mostly see live demonstrations where students come to the Miro boards and then they synchronously work on something. But I'm sure, because this is how it works, like I've only seen some case teachers at Harvard who uses it. So they create the tool or create the, I think they're called rooms or something, I forgot. But there's a link available, and then students can very well use the link after the class or outside of the class time, and then they can perhaps use that tool asynchronously. And then for the critical thinking, they can, it could be very well or effective tool, especially if the instructor uses it as a scaffolding mechanism. What I mean by that is that with the sticky notes, for example, in a whiteboard, an instructor, in this case you, Isabel, you can put some prompt questions that would allow students to think more critically. For example, what are your assumptions? How do you know that those assumptions hold true? Like, how would you challenge those assumptions? Or you can ask your students to challenge each other's assumptions and then analyze the arguments and develop arguments with these prompt tools in a Miro board.
Great.
I would just I would just add that potentially, I mean, you could use Miro also synchronously with the students to do what Deniz just described, as well as having them use it asynchronously. So you can actually go through their products in the class. And there are a few other tools that we added for collaboration in our tables. So some of them may be more suitable. So I would suggest checking out those 2 or 3 generally. Anyone else maybe wants to share with us quickly their thoughts? We have Brian and Robert and Dina, Blaine. Blaine, maybe you would like to share something with us about here, your questions maybe?
I find a lot of time that I have a prejudice against students collaborating. So I think I'd like to know like more ways to know how they, like, I was just thinking, I sort of answered my questions. I was working through one of my projects here thinking, if I put something up in discussions and ask them to reply to each other and to keep going in, then I'll have a sort of a recording of their back and forth. You know, it happens so fast in a classroom, and I don't know if it's useful or annoying to them to have to do it all on a thing where it's all being recorded and they put in there every whatever, so they're getting credit kind of thing, as opposed to just, you know, going to each other on a text or a phone call or something, say, what do you think of this? You know, it's great, but I would change this, and they're done, you know. I don't know. I think I personally would like sort of input from other teachers and from y'all about maybe how to get over my insistence that they all do everything by themselves, or that everybody be responsible for their own input, or this collaborative. I myself hated collaboration in artwork and in those kind of projects. So it was probably really good for me, but I didn't like it at all.
Well, I mean, all I can say in the very short time that we have is that I'm going back to what I've said before, which is all of this can just start with one small component that you're willing to try out in your course. It really doesn't have to be a complete course redesign. So when you are saying, I'm not sure about collaboration, I'm not sure how to make it work, take one component that you are more confident with experimenting with, maybe one module or one class or one assignment.
Yeah,
that would be my first and probably most valuable advice about making any changes. Secondly, I think that, and Deniz, correct me if I'm wrong, I think a tool like Parasol, which is successful with getting students to discuss a document or a piece of text, I think a tool like Parasol is definitely worth a shot for what you're trying to do, because it is very dynamic kind of conversation. Am I right, Deniz? Do you want to maybe add or correct me on that?
That's a great point, and thanks, Blaine, for the comment and your personal experience as you were a student. Perhaps you weren't enjoying collaborative work, but Parasol is a great way because first of all, you can upload PDFs and like very heavy readings, but you can also put the PDFs or some kind of a, I guess PDFs would work for a art piece, let's say, or something, or a visual that students could critique each other. And that only that part, only later stage, not the creative stage, but the critique stage may be collaborative. And also one of the things, one of the overlooked assumptions in peer instruction, for example, is that the very important step for peer instruction or a collaborative problem solving that Professor Eric Mazur has been using in his teaching is that students work individually first. So that's a must thing. That's the first, that's the prerequisite. And then they discuss. I think that kind of reflects on your teaching, could be reflecting on your teaching, because the creative stage, as I mentioned, could be done individually, and then they can upload the PDFs of their work or their kind of a visual or a something that they can discuss with each other at a later stage on Parasol, so that they can also share their comments anonymously. As far as I know, I'm not sure for that, but as far as I remember, there's an option that students can choose to be anonymous.
And there are also other software for annotation. Again, there's advantages, disadvantages, but as a general approach, again, I would say just pick something small that you're confident with and that you do think needs some kind of improvement, and try something small out, and really do, I would say, follow the stage of, getting the sources, the resources, get the buy-in from other instructors, from the students, explain to them, what is the point, what is the purpose, what is the benefit of doing this? It's not just an experiment. So we are essentially at the end. Can we stay for a few more minutes? Is anyone interested in staying for a few more minutes? I'm happy to, but I want to make sure that we can. If anybody else has any more questions or anything else to share.
So I can stay, but I'm also conscious and I'm really aware of everyone's time. So if anyone has a question and wants to stay longer, I really want to thank Marty and then Rea for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I think it was actually really useful. And then the tools, I think that's also, I'm really excited about start reading and trying them out. And then of course, we're gonna provide the resources that we actually learn in this presentation.
Right. Yeah, that would be great if we could somewhere get, because yeah, one would need to stick one's nose into those a little bit, to check them out a little bit and see what they do and what they don't do. But thank you very much for your time and attention and guiding us a little there and coaching us. So
it's our pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your attention and your time, everyone.
okay.
Thank you.
That's been good. I think you've raised a lot of questions and things that we all feel like now we're ready to discuss and go into some.
We're happy to follow up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again for inviting us, Isabel, also for organizing, and Blaine for your help and support.